This is a belated video response to FringeElements, Mr. 1001 Nights, and RaymondDundas. In this video, I will address the claims made against my last video, the case against radical philosophy. Also, because there seems to be a great deal of confusion over my last video, I shall reformulate my arguments in this video to make them easier to understand. I'll start by addressing the central claims FringeElements makes against me in several of his videos. FringeElements has said many things that are simply untrue, and unfortunately it seems that he has convinced a number of people of straw-man versions of my argument. Incidentally, he has also misrepresented himself as the victim of a conspiracy which never actually existed. This perpetuation of false rumors has been furthered by the fact that very few people actually watched my video. YouTube analytics reveals that only 19% of people watched my video all the way through. This means that 79% did not watch my video all the way through. Furthermore, the average viewer of my video watched about 6 minutes of my video. This means that the average viewer only watched about 15% of the total length of my video. How could people understand the argument I was making if they didn't even watch the video? Furthermore, how could someone identify a false claim about a video that they didn't even watch? But never mind this. Let's move on to FringeElements' claims. Firstly, FringeElements claims that my video and Spock Talk's video was a personal attack on him and his philosophy. This is why he made a video in order to preempt both my and Spock's video before either of them were actually released. His claim is patently false, and I will explain why. Fringe, myself, and Spock Talk occasionally speak in a Skype room which we're all a part of. One day, when Fringe was absent, I told Spock about several doubts and concerns I was having concerning anarchism, anti-statism, and other radical political philosophies in general. I also provided arguments as to why I thought that beliefs in any of these philosophies were unjustified. After telling him this, Spock largely agreed and offered some of his thoughts on the subject. I then told Spock that I had planned to make a video on the subject in the near future. Later, both of us talked to Fringe when all of us were conversing in a Skype room. While talking to FringeElements, Spock and I offered him many arguments against speculative politics that we had previously discussed. As examples, we showed how the arguments against speculative politics could be applied to Fringe's anti-statism in order to help him understand the argument. FringeElements became visibly annoyed and angry. His tone became very harsh, and he left the Skype room in the middle of the conversation. After this, FringeElements apparently seems to have thought that there was a cabal in the Skype room that was out to get him personally. This is why he proceeded to make a video preempting the arguments that Spock and I were supposedly going to make against his political positions. What he did not realize is that during our conversations, Spock and I were not out to get him, but instead used examples of his political positions simply because he happened to be there at the time. The videos that I made were planned far in advance of talking to FringeElements. So FringeElements' assertion that people in the Skype room are out to get him simply aren't true. Next, Fringe implied that Spock and I used the same definition of radical politics. He offered no evidence to support this notion. Now, in his video, Spock defines radical politics as, quote, any philosophy that wants to change society in a fundamental way based upon pure speculation. In my last video, I defined radical politics as any school of thought that believes and advocates for a non-existent future society that has never existed before in the past, does not exist now, and which also differs significantly in character from past and present societies. While these definitions might be related, they are obviously not the same thing. Therefore, FringeElements' implication is false. FringeElements also implied that Spock and I made the same arguments. To anybody who watched either of our videos, this should be obviously false. Spock and I may have reached similar conclusions, and some of our arguments were certainly very similar, but the actual content and logical form of the arguments were totally different. despite Fringe's attempt to equivocate the two. FringeElements further claims that the definition of radical politics Spock and I give in our videos were not useful because they don't reflect common usage. He also added that they are crap definitions that create more problems than they solve. However, his claim is silly. What makes a concept useful is not whether or not it reflects common usage, but whether a concept accurately describes a state of affairs. For instance, the word theory in common usage simply means a guess or conjecture designed to explain something. However, in science, the common use of the word theory doesn't mean what scientists mean by the word theory. Scientists use the word theory to mean a testable hypothesis confirmed through study and experimentation that can be used to make accurate and reliable predictions. So Fringe's claim seems to be absurd. This is because if we accept his reasoning, we would have to claim that scientists' use of the word theory isn't useful because it doesn't reflect common usage, and that is obviously false. More, the assertion that the definition is crap is merely an ad hominem attack, and not a serious attack on the legitimacy of the definition that either Spock or I gave. FringeElements further claims that it follows from Spock and my argument that no new policies should be implemented that haven't already been tried. And many commenters have incidentally claimed the same thing. Since many people seem to be confused by the argument, let me reformulate my argument in a way that is more straightforward. Before I do this, let me offer definitions of terms that people will find less objectionable than my previous definition of radical politics. I will first define the term speculative politics as follows. Speculative politics, a process by which one tries to invent or justify a society, policy prescription, or other such idea only by imagining it in a thought experiment. Now, with that definition in mind, let me provide the following argument. Premise 1. All beliefs formed from the methodology of speculative politics are fallible and highly unreliable. Premise 2. All anarchists who aren't primitivists, some communists, some fascists, and some socialists form beliefs about their preferred form of government from the methodology of speculative politics. Conclusion. Therefore, the belief of all anarchists who aren't primitivists, some communists, some fascists, and some socialists about their preferred form of government are unjustified. Exceptions to the argument are communists and socialists who want to return to historical communism or socialism, such as the USSR, China, or Cuba. Fascists who want to return to historical fascism, such as Nazi Germany or Fascist Italy. Or primitivists who want to return to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle as exhibited by primitive peoples today. But what justification do we have for the first premise? We have reason to believe that the methodology of speculative politics leads to unjustified beliefs because most schools of thought who have engaged in speculative politics as a way to justify their beliefs overwhelmingly tend to have unreliable beliefs about their preferred form of government. Utopian socialism's ideal did not resemble its implementation. Communist ideal did not resemble historical communism. And futurism has a long history of mostly failed predictions about what future societies would look like. Furthermore, when economics has relied on the speculations of intuitive thought experiments, controlled studies have shown their conclusions to be dead wrong. Anarchism and anti-statism are like a broken clock. Even a broken clock is right twice a day, but if you want to know what time it is, you're far better off examining a clock that actually works. If you want a more detailed justification of the first premise, watch my video, The Case Against Radical Politics. But what of the second premise? How can we be sure that all non-primitivist anarchists, some communists and some socialists and some fascists, form beliefs about the preferred form of government from the methodology of speculative politics? Let's start with anarchists. Anarchists do not want to return to historical anarchism. Historical instances of anarchism, which real anarchists would agree are actual instances of anarchism, mainly constitute instances of civil war, in which anarchist experiments in question were destroyed by superior military forces, whereupon these societies reverted to statism. Anarcho-capitalists and other anarchists also do not want a society resembling medieval Ireland or Iceland. This is because they don't want a very poor, primitive society that permits slavery, didn't enforce judicial decisions, was highly isolated, did not engage in foreign trade, and which was also highly uneducated and illiterate. If anarchists don't believe in something resembling actual history, then they must believe in something not resembling history. The only intelligible thing that humans can believe in that does not resemble history is a thought experiment. Therefore, all non-primitivist anarchists must believe in a thought experiment that has yet to be realized. What about communists, fascists, and socialists? Well, if you point to instances of existing fascism, communism, or socialism, such as the USSR, Cuba, or Nazi Germany, many adherents to these positions will claim that these aren't true instances of their preferred form of government, but are rather a false caricature. So, if these socialists, communists, and fascists believe that their preferred form of government hasn't existed, then they must believe in a thought experiment that has yet to be realized. Now, the main argument I've given you is deductively valid. If all the premises of my argument are true, then the conclusion must be true. If the only way to attack my argument is to show that it contains false premises, since all the premises of my argument appear prima facie to be true, we are therefore justified in believing that the conclusion must also be true. But doesn't it follow from my argument that all propositions of policy that have never existed before can never be justified? And if this is the case, then doesn't this warrant conservatism and a continued preservation of the status quo? Let me answer the first question with a story. Suppose you're trying to cross a frozen lake that you've never been to before and know nothing about. In this event, would you want to test to see if the ice is thick enough to hold your weight before crossing? Or would you prefer to blindly wander across the ice, hoping and speculating that it will be thick enough to ensure that you don't drown? I think that the answer here is rather obvious. Always test the ice. But what about the second question? Does it follow from my argument that only conservatism and beliefs pertaining to the existing status quo are justified? No, it certainly does not. The reason for this is that the methodology of speculative politics is not the only methodology by which new propositions of policy can be invented and justified. There are several possible alternatives. Here is a basic outline of just one possible scientific approach to inventing and justifying policy prescriptions. 1. Imagine a falsifiable policy prescription that makes testable predictions and is also desirable. 2. Give operational definitions for all relevant terms being measured. 3. Conduct a series of controlled studies and experiments to see if the policy prescriptions have the intended effects. 4. If the test evidence does not support the policy prescription having its intended effects, then repeat step 1. If the test evidence does support the proposition having the intended effects, then implement a small-scale regional test. 6. If the small-scale regional test does not support the policy prescription having the intended effects, then repeat step 1. 7. If the evidence from the regional test supports the idea that the policy prescription would have the intended effects, then we are justified in believing that a policy proposition would have the intended effects on both a larger scale and a smaller scale. Notice, this scientific approach to politics does not fit the definition of speculative politics. This is because this process is not a process by which one tries to invent or justify a society, policy prescription, or other idea by imagining it in a thought experiment. Instead, it is a method by which one tries to invent and justify a society through rigorous scientific testing instead of idle speculation. Now, I am not saying that this scientific approach is the only way to justify policy prescriptions, but it is certainly one way to do so. Thus, it does not follow that if a policy proposition has not been tried, that it can never be justified. This is because we can imagine at least one way to justify an untried policy proposition through scientific testing. Later, FringeElements claims that although the arguments Spock and I made were logically sound, the alleged goal of the argument against radical politics that we were making was to make an off-case argument that dismissed radical politics without going into the particular details of radical politics. However, according to FringeElements, in order to build an off-case argument, one has to make an on-case argument. So, the attempts of Spock and I failed. Now first, I agree that the different arguments Spock and I made were logically sound. I don't think that FringeElements realizes that by saying this, he is essentially conceding that Spock and I were right all along. However, the rest of Fringe arguments is rather silly. It was never the goal of Spock's argument or my argument to dismiss radical politics without going into the details. Therefore, Fringe's conclusion that our alleged attempt failed is completely unwarranted because it is based on a false premise. Fringe then moves on to accuse both Spock Talk and myself of linguistic trickery, wordplay, and sophistry. Now I should mention that the burden of proof is on him to show this. Since FringeElements did not offer any evidence or argument that would seek to justify his claim, and since it isn't common knowledge, we can safely dismiss him for not meeting the burden of proof. Lastly, FringeElements proposed a method by which his brand of anti-statism could be justified, which I simply feel the need to comment on. Fringe's position is that society should be overthrown by a totalitarian dictatorship. This allegedly benevolent dictator would then divide up society into a series of different large-scale social experiments, which all citizens would be forced to participate in. Once the dictator found the optimal way to run an anti-statist society through scientific experimentation, he would, for some reason, relinquish all of his power immediately and voluntarily, and the society in question would then convert to anti-statism. To most people, the myriad of problems associated with this approach should be obvious. Here is a list of just the most obvious problems. 1. The overwhelming majority of people have no desire to live under a dictatorship, and nor do they want to be manipulated and forced into a series of large-scale social experiments. 2. Given this fact, how would this supposed dictatorship come about? 3. What reason do we have to suppose that the dictator would implement anti-statist experiments, given that the only dictatorships that have ever emerged from democracies have become fascist states? 4. What reason do we have to suppose that a dictator would have the organization and resources necessary to force people into a giant series of anti-statist experiments? 5. Wouldn't a dictatorship forcing people into a series of experiments be a push factor that would cause many citizens to renounce their citizenship and leave the dictatorship? 6. On what grounds would the dictator choose the optimal form of a stateless society? 7. Assuming the dictator had found the optimal form of anti-statism, what reason do we have to believe that he would voluntarily relinquish his power, given that most dictators throughout history have overwhelmingly tended to refuse giving up their absolute power? FringeElements' proposed solution relies on a large number of assumptions. Here's a simpler theory. A dictatorship would not result in anti-statism, but would be more analogous to dictatorships that have existed throughout history. Since this theory relies on fewer assumptions than FringeElements' theory, we can conclude that it is more likely to be correct according to Occam's razor. FringeElements should agree with me that his proposed solution is silly because, in his words, not mine, his solution is a pipe dream. Let's move on from FringeElements to Mr. 1001 Nights' video. His video is very brief but rather vague. He says, quote, "People from the distant past would consider our society very radical. Therefore, the historical record does support the possibility of radical change, just not in predictable ways." If you recall in my first video, I never claimed that radical change was impossible, which is what Mr. 1001 Nights seems to be implying. I claimed that we are not justified in believing that proposed societies based upon pure speculation would exist as they are imagined. Next he says, quote, "Over time, the acceptance of the status quo becomes just as inaccurate as radical philosophies." Now, as he never clarifies or offers evidence for this idea, nor does he show how this idea follows from something he said previously, we have no reason to accept what he's saying, as the burden of proof is on Mr. 1001 Nights, and he made no attempt to meet it. Next, Mr. 1001 Nights implies that things are getting worse. He implies that rates of happiness are in decline. He also implies that mental illness, work-related injury, obesity, and the rates of species extinction are all increasing. He then claims that our choice is to face destruction and accept the status quo, or to choose other alternatives that are uncertain. Unfortunately for Mr. 1001 Nights, what he says is either false, misleading, or an exaggeration. According to the Pew Global Attitudes Project, global happiness is actually increasing. Over the last 5 years, Pew also found no change in the level of happiness in Americans and other Western countries. Furthermore, the Pew Center notes that Western countries have the highest level of happiness of any other countries on Earth. Also, contrary to what Mr. 1001 Nights implies, work-related injuries on a per capita basis are actually declining. Now, while it is true that reported rates of mental illness are increasing in the West, the cause of this is not actually clear. It may be because the number of conditions classified as mental illnesses is greater than ever before and is also growing exponentially. Also, the increasing rate of mental illness might not reflect a real increase in the rates of mental illness, but better reporting procedures concerning mental health. In addition, it is not at all obvious that the increasing rates of mental illness have anything to do with the viability of forms of government that exist in the West. Mr. 1001 Nights mentions obesity. Now, it is true that obesity is increasing, but that is partially a function of how obesity is defined. Obesity is defined as a body mass index over 25. The BMI is calculated as a ratio of weight in kilograms divided by height in meters multiplied by height in meters. It was adopted by the U.S. National Institute of Health and the CDC in 1998. It is a highly flawed method of measuring obesity because it does not differentiate between weight from fat and weight from muscle. According to the current medical definition of obesity, Michael Jordan is literally obese because he has a BMI over 25, despite being one of the fittest athletes in the world. Furthermore, I don't see how obesity is some sort of end-of-the-world phenomena, so this seems to be just an irrelevant red herring. Also, the rate of species extinction has been significantly exaggerated in the media, and what has been reported is a lot less than what is actually the case. Lastly, Mr. 1001 Nights' conclusion is that we have a choice between uncertain, radical alternatives and the extinction of the human race if we accept the status quo. This is a blatant false dichotomy. There are many ways to reform the status quo that we are justified in believing in because they have actually been tested. For instance, countries like Chile, Singapore, and Sweden all force their citizens to save a portion of their income and then to invest it in stocks and bonds. Because of this, these countries are able to achieve higher real rates of return at lower overall costs relative to government-run Social Security schemes. Moreover, we can infer that because tax-deductible 401ks, Roth IRAs, and traditional IRAs have higher rates of return in the U.S. relative to Social Security, that a policy of abolishing Social Security whilst forcing savings would cause citizens to have more overall wealth for retirement, and this would also cause an increase in investment. Doing something like this in the U.S. would be a significant change in the status quo. But we could still be justified in believing that the U.S. would have results similar to those that I've just described because similar countries have been able to do the same thing in the past, and because similar domestic policies have had analogous outcomes. So, the outcome could be potentially predicted. Lastly, let us move on to the claim of RaymondDundas. Raymond begins by claiming that the definition of radical politics I gave is wrong because it is continuous and not discrete. This claim is, however, the very essence of the continuum fallacy. By Raymond's logic, since there is nothing in the definition of mountains that makes them totally distinct from hills, we have to conclude that hills and mountains don't exist, and this is obviously absurd. Next, Raymond claims that if we were to apply my definition of radical politics to any period in the past, that civilization would not have advanced. However, this is absurd. My definition isn't an argument for or against anything, so it does not follow that if a past society would have accepted my definition, that their society would not have advanced. Now, what I think Raymond is trying to say, but fails to completely articulate, is that if we accept the conclusion of my argument, i.e., that beliefs formed from the methodology of speculative politics are unjustified, that past societies would not have advanced. Now, first of all, there's no way to know empirically if that would have been true, because counterfactual propositions about the past cannot be tested. However, what Raymond says logically does not follow. This is because we can imagine past societies using a scientific methodology to test political prescriptions instead of relying on the methodology of speculative politics. After this, Raymond takes issue with the assumptions of anarchism which I outlined in my last video. He initially argues against accepting premises inconsistent with the assumptions of anarchism that I posited. He also argued that to argue against particular anarchist assumptions, that I'd have to be making a series of positive claims which I never provided an argument for. By doing so, he missed the point I was making entirely. I was not questioning the legitimacy of any particular anarchist assumption in my video, contrary to RaymondDundas' straw man. In actuality, I merely invoked Occam's razor. By doing so, I tried to show how the theory that anarchism would not work in a place like the United States is more likely to be true than the converse. Occam's razor states that when two theories explain something equally well, that the theory that makes the fewest number of assumptions is probably correct. This is because the fewer assumptions a theory has, the less likely it is that any one of those assumptions is false. In my video, I argued that anarchists would generally have to admit about 15 primary assumptions to uphold their theory. However, I could explain why anarchism wouldn't work in the U.S. with a theory that relied on a single primary assumption. Since this theory had fewer assumptions, I argued, it is more likely that anarchism won't work. Raymond also took particular issue with one of the last assumptions in the set. In the video I argued that for the U.S. to be anarchist, we would have to assume that the nuclear arsenal of the former U.S. government would not be used against the newly created anarchist society or its neighbors. Raymond apparently did not understand this and thought that I meant that the U.S. would use nukes to threaten any newly created anarchist society, and he said he thought this was ridiculous. However, since his claim was based upon a straw man, I don't feel the need to say anything more on the matter. To end this video, I would like to say that there is an overwhelming amount of misinformation going on about the last video I made. Many subscribers of mine have uncritically accepted speculations and character attacks others have made on myself and Spock Talk without examining all the facts. So, I would like to leave you all with a few suggestions. First, don't rely on the opinions of others to judge the arguments I've made. Look at the arguments themselves and judge them on their own merits. Second, if an argument I've made contradicts something you believe, try not to simply react negatively. Instead, judge the argument critically in a calm and rational way. Third, if you disagree with something I've said, make an argument explaining why it's wrong. Don't just assert the opposite. And lastly, if you believe that there's a problem with the core argument I've made, then form an argument attacking the premises of my argument. The argument I've given you is deductively valid. The only way to argue against it is to show that it contains false premises. Anything else is just a waste of time. Stay classy, YouTube.